Joining me on NYSE Floor Talk today is Laura Correnti. She is the founder and CEO at Deep Blue Sports and Entertainment. Laura, it's fantastic to have you here. Thanks for joining me on Floor Talk.
Thank you for having me, Judy. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Laura, you just rang the closing bell. Great job, by the way, ringing that bell and celebrating National Girl and Women in Sports Day. Exciting day. So now, tell me, what was the inspiration behind founding Deep Blue, and how does it aim to transform the landscape of women's sports marketing and representation?
Sure. So, quick backstory for context. So I was a three-sport athlete growing up, played collegiate soccer at American University, and post that ended up going and getting my master's degree in advertising, in which I've been in the advertising media marketing business for nearly the last 20 years. And really there was that catalyst light bulb moment that happened in the 2019 Women's World Cup. If you recall, at that point, U.S. Women's national team had sued their employer for equal pay. And when the U.S. ended up lifting the trophy and winning the World Cup in 2019, the entire crowd in France was chanting, "Equal pay, equal pay." Nike put on a gorgeous spot that really commemorated the moment and where women's sports was going. And I remember at the time, between the chatter that was happening on social, coupled with all the commentators saying this time it feels different, there's so much momentum, which I feel like is a conversation we hear every 4 years around the World Cup and the Olympics as we get this galvanization around women's sports. But for whatever reason, Judy, I was prompted to go at the time on the NWSL website, which was a domestic league here in the States, knowing full well that many of the women that played on the U.S. women's national team would be coming back to ultimately play there in their regular season. And I scrolled to the very bottom of the NWSL website. Being in marketing, it's very hard to look at big tentpole consumer events without having that perspective. I was curious to know what the commercial viability would be. Would this, in fact, be a tipping point? Would things be different? And so if you were to scroll to the bottom of that website in 2019, there were 4 brand partners for the league. There was an apparel company. There was a cable network at the time, Lifetime. Women's Cable Network was the distributor for the league at that point. There was a health and wellness supplements company and a lawn care company. And I remember thinking at that moment, what the mass consumer market is not aware of, because again, it's a business systems and infrastructure, is that if this set of brands doesn't evolve and if investment doesn't continue to increase, this conversation may be a moot point. And so in that moment, I sort of went on this, multi-year journey to really get underneath the systems, to understand what really were the barriers to entry and why there was consumer demand, but commercial advertisers, marketers, and media companies weren't necessarily meeting it.
Now, Laura, tell me, how do you envision Deep Blue addressing the gap in media investment and sponsorship for women athletes, which has historically been a major issue in the sports industry?
Sure. So in my business in particular, I grew up in the advertising industry as a media buyer. So what that means is on behalf of some of the biggest brands in the world, spending hundreds of millions of dollars annually, I'm responsible for investing their money into the advertising marketplace to get the best return for their business objectives. As a buyer with nearly 20 years experience, I understand the infrastructure and how, when you look at commercial valuations, when you look at dollars coming in that is going to push things into prime time or building ancillary shoulder programming around it, what you realize is that for the last however many years, women's sports has been sold the same way men's sports has been sold, largely on a reach and efficiency play. What do women's sports at this current state in the market not deliver on? Reach and efficiency. So, for example, if you have $1 to invest on behalf of a brand, and you're given the opportunity to invest that dollar in Sunday Night Football versus the WNBA playoffs, for example, this dollar in Sunday Night Football, you don't have to justify that decision. So we started to uncover that the currencies are not necessarily reflective of the maturity of where women's sports is today, because largely they haven't been on prime time. In many instances, they haven't even been on television. And so as that continues to increase, we need to evaluate it for what it's actually delivering on, which is a brand and engagement play. What we see with women's sports fans, they are 2 to 3xing in every brand metric you could possibly imagine in comparison to general sports fans. So whether that's affinity, loyalty, lifetime value, they are exceeding that from a general sports perspective. So the currencies are not right, the metrics aren't right. And so when you could start to fix the systemic business challenge, now you're on your way to start to evaluate and move the money and making women's sports inherently an and, not an or. And we think this is important for women's growth. So we're leaning in very heavy on behalf of our brand clients that we're representing in the market from a media capacity. And then once we fix that, then you get into storytelling, making sure messages are reflective of the markets that we're representing, et cetera, and so forth. But we really feel we've found an interesting way in that hasn't necessarily been addressed thus far.
So Laura, tell me, what are Deep Blue's initiative and goals for the coming year?
Sure. So business currently roadmapped. We really have a game plan between now through LA 28 is sort of giving ourselves a bookmark, 3 parts of the business. So as I'm alluding to, agency services, so strategy, media, investment, creative, as well as experiential on behalf of our brand clients. So agency services as a pillar. We'll also be moving into branded entertainment. Many brands are very interested in financing these projects. So in addition to, getting in and underwriting, also surrounding that with media promotion to make sure the content is actually discoverable. Again, a visibility challenge that has existed thus far. So agency services, production services. And then we think there's a future state where Deep Blue could also develop a venture fund, get into the M&A business, essentially start taking the money and the strategies that we're developing and reinvesting it back into the market. So pronged portfolio approach, but we're really excited about it.
Now, I mentioned earlier that today is National Girls and Women in Sports Day. So tell me, what's your perspective on the importance of this day?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm living at 365 days a year at the moment, but I think it is important to take a pause and really reflect on how much progress has been made. You go back to Title IX passing in 1972. We're not that far out from it, relatively speaking. And so when you look at the tremendous inroads women's sports has been making, I would say particularly over the last 4, 5, 6 years, we're seeing record turnouts. I mean, 90,000 people attending a college volleyball game, at Nebraska. We're seeing WNBA playoffs here in Brooklyn, New York, sold out. I mean, the roof, that place was rocking. I haven't been in that incredible of a sports environment in New York in as long as I can remember. I was out at the World Cup, in Australia this past summer, seeing 70,000, 80,000 people going absolutely wild for these incredible women and the work that they're putting in on the field, but also the work that they're doing off the field. And so I think these moments in time throughout the year are really important to reflect and, take a look at what's working. But we're also hyper-focused on where we need to go next. So really using it as an opportunity to engage with the market, think about and plan for, not just the next year, the next 2, 5, 50. So I think it really is about that reflection, that spotlighting, and continuing to keep the conversation in the forefront.
All right. Well, Laura, wonderful to talk with you.
Likewise. Thank you,
Thanks
Judy.
for joining me on Floor Talk today.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.